History is often written by the victors, but in the case of Alexander III of Macedon, history was entirely rewritten by the sheer force of his will. By age 20, he was a king. By 30, he was a living god to millions. By 32, he was a corpse, leaving behind an empire that stretched from the jagged cliffs of Greece to the burning sands of India. Picture the scene in 334 BC. A small boat cuts across the turbulent waters of the Hellespont, separating Europe from Asia. A young man in gleaming armor stands at the prow, not waiting for the vessel to dock. He hurls a spear into the Asian soil, leaping onto the beach to claim the entire continent as spear won land before a single battle has been fought. This was not merely confidence, it was a terrifying, divine madness. He led an army of 40,000 against the Persian Empire, a superpower of millions, not to negotiate, but to erase the boundaries of the known world. Yet strip away the marble statues and the tales of divine parentage, and a more haunting figure emerges. Here was a man terrified of mediocrity, driven by the ghost of a demanding father and the whispers of an intense, mystic mother. He was a scholar who slept with a dagger and a copy of Homer's Iliad beneath his head, a paradoxical blend of enlightened philosopher and ruthless butcher. He sought to unify East and West in a wedding of cultures, yet he died in a feverish delirium, paranoid, and surrounded by generals waiting like vultures for his last breath. Why does a man who died over 2 millennia ago still command such intense fascination? Because Alexander represents the ultimate extreme of human potential and human frailty. His life poses an eternal, dangerous question. What happens when a single human being refuses to accept the word impossible? The story of the man who would conquer the world begins in a kingdom that the civilized world viewed as little more than a violent backwater. Alexander was born in July 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. It was a place of rough stone, hard drinking, and brutal politics, where kings were warriors first and statesmen second. To understand Alexander, one must understand the 2 titanic forces that forged him. He was the product of a volatile, dangerous union between King Philip II and his 4th wife, Olympias. Philip was a man of the earth, scarred, one-eyed, a brilliant military pragmatist who had transformed Macedonia's ragtag shepherds into the most feared army in Europe. He ruled through coercion, bribery, and the phalanx. Olympias was his opposite. A princess from Epirus, she was a woman of intense, terrifying mysticism. While Philip was away on endless campaigns, conquering Thrace and cowing the Greeks, Olympias controlled the boy's mind. She was a devotee of the snake cult of Dionysus, sleeping with serpents in her bed, a habit that alienated her husband and terrified the court. From Alexander's infancy, she drilled a singular, explosive idea into his head, that Philip was merely his mortal caretaker. She whispered that his true father was Zeus, the king of the gods, who had visited her in the night as a lightning bolt. This was not a bedtime story. It was a psychological weapon. It gave Alexander a divine mandate that would later fuel his refusal to accept human limitations. Growing up in the Macedonian court was not a safe existence. It was a daily lesson in survival. The palace was a shark tank of ambitious generals, rival wives, Georgian wives, and illegitimate children. Alexander learned early that power was not given. It was seized. He was competitive to a pathological degree. When messengers arrived with news of Philip's latest victory, Alexander would not celebrate. Instead, he would weep to his companions, "My father will anticipate everything. He will leave you and me no chance of performing a great and brilliant deed." He did not want a stable kingdom. He wanted a stage for glory. The first glimpse of his genius and his terrifying will came at age 12. A horse dealer brought a massive black stallion, Bucephalus, to the king. The beast was a monster, rearing and striking at anyone who came near. Philip, a man who had no patience for failure, ordered the useless animal taken away. Alexander broke rank. He shouted that the adults were discarding a perfect horse because they lacked the skill to handle him. Philip, amused and irritated, challenged the boy. If he failed, he would pay the price of the horse himself. Alexander had noticed what the seasoned generals had missed. The horse was shying away from its own shadow. He did not use a whip. He took the bridle and gently turned Bucephalus toward the sun, erasing the shadow. He whispered to the animal, vaulted onto its back, and rode him at a full gallop. When he returned, the court fell silent. Philip did not laugh. He wept. He kissed his son and delivered a prophecy that felt more like a warning. "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." But Philip knew that raw talent without discipline was dangerous. To sharpen the weapon he had created, he hired the greatest intellect of the age. At 13, Alexander was sent to the Nymphaeum at Mysa to study under Aristotle. This was a collision of two worlds. Aristotle, the master of logic and taxonomy, tried to teach Alexander the virtues of the golden mean, moderation in all things. Alexander absorbed the lessons on biology, medicine, and rhetoric, but he rejected the moderation. He was captivated instead by the Iliad. Aristotle gave him an annotated copy of Homer's epic, and Alexander began to model himself on Achilles, the tragic, invincible hero who chose a short, glorious life over a long, obscure one. Aristotle taught him how to think. Homer taught him how to dream. The education ended abruptly at 16. Philip was marching to war against Byzantium and left Alexander as regent of Macedonia. The boy didn't just keep the seat warm. When a Thracian tribe revolted, Alexander didn't wait for his father. He marched the army out, crushed the rebellion, expelled the population, and renamed their city after himself, Alexandropolis. He was signaling to the world that he was ready. However, the bond between father and son was brittle. As Philip consolidated his power over Greece, he decided to marry a young Macedonian noblewoman, Cleopatra Eurydice. This was a direct threat to Alexander. Olympias was a foreigner. Alexander was only half Macedonian. Any son born of Philip's new, pure-blooded marriage could delegitimize Alexander's claim to the throne. The tension exploded at the wedding feast in 337 BC. The wine was flowing freely when Attalus, the bride's uncle, stood to make a toast. He prayed that this union would finally give the kingdom a legitimate heir. It was a public declaration of war on Alexander's birthright. Alexander hurled his cup at the general, shouting, "And what of me? Am I a bastard?" Philip, drunk and enraged at the insult to his new wife's family, drew his sword and lunged at his son. But years of old wounds and too much wine took their toll. The most powerful king in Europe tripped and crashed to the floor. Alexander stood over his fallen father, sneering with cold, lethal wit. "See there, the man who makes preparations to pass out of Europe into Asia, overturned in passing from one seat to another." The insult shattered the court. Alexander and Olympias fled into exile. Although a fragile reconciliation was eventually brokered, the trust was dead. The atmosphere in Pella was thick with paranoia. Every shadow held a dagger. The climax of this domestic tragedy arrived in the summer of 336 BC at the ancient capital of Aigai. Philip was celebrating the marriage of his daughter. a grand event meant to showcase his power before he launched his invasion of Persia. He walked into the theater alone, dressed in white, unarmed, waving away his bodyguards to show his confidence. It was the mistake of a man who thought he was untouchable. Pausanias, a disgruntled former lover and bodyguard of the king, lunged from the crowd. He drove a Celtic dagger between Philip's ribs, piercing the heart. The king of Macedon died in the dust before he could draw a breath. Pandemonium erupted. As the assassin was hunted down and butchered by the king's friends, Alexander did not hesitate. He was 20 years old, but he moved with the cold precision of a veteran. With the backing of the army and the ruthless counsel of his mother, he was proclaimed king immediately. The purge began before the funeral fires were cold. Potential rivals were executed. His cousin Amyntas was killed. Olympias, seizing the moment, had Philip's new wife and infant child murdered. A brutal act that Alexander accepted as necessary politics. The boy who had studied poetry and tamed horses was gone. In his place stood the king of Macedonia, commander of the Greeks, and the master of a professional killing machine. The training was over. Alexander looked across the narrow sea toward Asia. The Persian Empire was waiting, unaware that the storm had already gathered. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stood on the banks of the Hellespont, the narrow strip of water separating Europe from Asia. Behind him lay a bankrupt kingdom and a skeptical army. Ahead lay the Persian Empire, a colossal superpower that controlled 40% of the world's population and possessed gold reserves so vast they could buy every mercenary in Greece 10 times over. Alexander did not invade Persia. He assaulted it. His opening move was an act of reckless theater. As his boat approached the Asian shore, he didn't wait to dock. He hurled a spear into the sand, vaulted into the surf, and declared the entire continent Spear Won Land. It was a message to his men and to history. There would be no retreat. The first test came at the Granicus River. The local Persian satraps had gathered their cavalry on the opposite bank, confident that the steep, muddy slopes would halt the Macedonian advance. His generals begged him to wait for dawn. Alexander ignored them. "I should be ashamed before the Hellespont if I were afraid of a little stream like this," he said. He led the charge himself, plunging into the river. It was a chaotic brawl, not a battle. In the crush of bodies, a Persian axe descended on Alexander's head, splitting his helmet and dazing him. As the axe rose for the killing blow, Black Cletus, a captain of the royal guard, severed the attacker's arm at the shoulder. Alexander had come within a split second of being a footnote in history. Instead, he emerged as a warlord who bled with his men. As he swept south, a pattern emerged. He didn't just defeat armies, he dismantled the logic of the impossible. At the city of Gordium, he was presented with an ancient ox cart tied with a knot of cornel bark so complex that prophecy stated only the future ruler of Asia could loose it. Alexander wrestled with the knot, frustrated, until he stepped back, drew his sword, and sliced it in half. The solution was brutal and efficient. He would not play by the world's rules. He would cut through them. The stakes rose in 333 BC at Issus. King Darius III, the ruler of the known world, finally marched to meet the upstart. The Persian army was a moving city, outnumbering the Macedonians at least 3-1. Darius brought his wife, his mother, and his children, treating the battle like a royal procession. It was a fatal arrogance. On the narrow coastal plain, numbers meant nothing. Alexander identified Darius's golden chariot in the center of the line. Ignoring the flanks, he formed his cavalry into a giant wedge and drove it straight at the king. The sight of Alexander, eyes wide, screaming, cutting down the royal guard, broke Darius's nerve. The King of Kings turned his chariot and fled, leaving his family and his honor in the dust. Alexander captured the royal family, but treated them with the courtesy of a king, a psychological masterstroke that painted him not as a barbarian invader, but as the legitimate successor. But Alexander's genius was perhaps most terrifying at the siege of Tyre. The island city, half a mile off the coast, was considered impregnable. Alexander simply changed the geography. For 7 months, his engineers piled rocks, timber, and earth into the sea, building a causeway to the island while under constant fire. When the Macedonians finally breached the walls, the release of tension was horrific. 8,000 Tyrians were slaughtered. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The message reverberated across the Mediterranean. Nature protects no one from Alexander. The climax of his tactical brilliance arrived in 331 BC at Gaugamela. This was the final showdown. Darius had chosen a flat plain to unleash his scythed chariots, war machines designed to shred infantry. He fielded 250,000 men against Alexander's 40,000. Alexander slept soundly the night before the battle, waking only when his generals shook him. On the field, he performed a maneuver that is still studied in military academies today. He marched his infantry at an angle, stretching the Persian line until a gap appeared in their center. Into this vacuum, he drove the wedge. The hammer and anvil struck. The Persian center collapsed. Darius fled again, only to be murdered by his own disillusioned generals months later. Alexander stood over the body of his rival, covered him with his own cloak, and wept. The war for vengeance was over. The war for empire had begun. As the army pushed east, taking the fabled cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, victory began to rot the soul of the mission. Alexander burned the great palace of Persepolis, either in a drunken rage or a calculated act of symbolic destruction. He began to adopt Persian dress, wearing the purple robe and the diadem. He demanded proskynesis, the act of prostrating oneself, from his proud Macedonian veterans. To men who had bled for him, seeing their king act like a Persian god was a betrayal. The tension exploded in Samarkand. During a drinking bout, Clytus, the man who had saved him at the Granicus, mocked Alexander's growing arrogance, comparing him unfavorably to his father Philip. Blind with wine and rage, Alexander snatched a spear from a guard and drove it through his friend's heart. The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander collapsed, sobbing, but the line had been crossed. The liberator was becoming a tyrant. Still, the hunger for the end of the world drove him on. He dragged his exhausted, mutinous men over the Hindu Kush mountains and into India. At the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC, they faced King Porus and a wall of war elephants. It was a nightmare fought in mud and monsoon rain. Men were trampled and impaled, though Alexander won, capturing Porus and admiring his bravery. The spirit of the Macedonian army broke. They had marched 11,000 miles. They were rich, scarred, and tired. When Alexander ordered them to march toward the Ganges, they refused. They stood in silence, weeping, until Alexander realized he had finally found an enemy he could not defeat: his own men's desire to go home. He turned back, but the return journey was a punishment. He marched them through the Gedrosian desert, a waterless hellscape. Soldiers drank their own urine. The weak were left to the vultures. 3/4 of the army that entered the desert never came out. When the survivors stumbled back into Susa, Alexander was master of the largest empire history had ever seen. He had fused the cultures of East and West, founding 70 cities and altering the genetic and cultural makeup of Asia forever. But he was a man running out of time, his body scarred, his mind feverish, preparing for new wars in Arabia that he would never fight. To the world, Alexander was a golden god, a conqueror who strode across continents with the confidence of the divine. But inside the royal tent, in the quiet hours between battles, he was a man slowly being crushed by the weight of his own legend. The higher he climbed, the thinner the air became, and the deeper his isolation grew. His life was defined by a paradox. He was surrounded by thousands who worshipped him, yet he trusted almost no one. The one exception was Hephaestion. If Alexander was Achilles, Hephaestion was his Patroclus. They had been raised together in the hills of Macedonia, studied together under Aristotle, and fought side by side from the very beginning. Hephaestion was not just a general or a lover. He was Alexander's tether to humanity. When the queen mother of Persia, Sisygambis, mistakenly bowed to Hephaestion instead of Alexander, the king laughed off the potentially fatal error, saying, "Do not worry, mother. He too is Alexander." It was the only relationship where Alexander could drop the mask of the deity and simply be a man. But as the army moved further east, the intimacy of the Macedonian inner circle began to rot. Alexander's decision to adopt Persian customs, wearing the diadem, using a signet ring, and employing Persian eunuchs, was not merely a fashion statement. It was a desperate political gamble to unify his empire. To his rugged Macedonian veterans, however, it looked like madness. They saw their king becoming the very enemy they had fought to destroy. This cultural friction birthed a creeping paranoia. The open, boisterous court of his youth was replaced by a shadowy world of spies and whispers. In 327 BC, the Pages conspiracy was uncovered, a plot by the young sons of Macedonian nobles to murder him in his sleep. The retribution was swift and gruesome, but the betrayal cut deep. These were the sons of his friends. Even the intellect that had shaped him was not safe. Callisthenes, the court historian and nephew of Aristotle, refused to perform the Persian act of phroskinesis, bowing. Alexander, seeing this refusal as a spark for mutiny, had the philosopher thrown into a dungeon, where he died in filth. The student of Aristotle had become the jailer of philosophy. To cope with the physical agony of his wounds, he had been stabbed, slashed, and shot with arrows more times than he could count. And the mental burden of godhood, Alexander turned to the Macedonian vice, wine. His drinking bouts became legendary and terrifying. Entire days were lost to the goblet. It was in one of these drunken hazes that he burned Persepolis, and in another that he murdered Clytus. The alcohol was numbing the man, but it was unleashing the tyrant. His romantic life was equally complex, driven by a mixture of political necessity and sudden, overwhelming passion. He bypassed the noblewomen of Macedonia to marry Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian warlord. He spotted her among captives after the siege of the Sogdian Rock, and by all accounts, fell instantly in love. It was a scandal to his generals, a barbarian queen for the lord of Asia, but Alexander ignored them. Later, at the mass weddings in Susa, he forced 90 of his officers to marry Persian noblewomen in a grand, bizarre ceremony meant to literally breed a new ruling race. It was a vision of unity that only he could see, and one his men resented deeply. The final, shattering blow came not on the battlefield, but in the cool palaces of Ecbatana in 324 BC. Hephaestion fell ill with a fever. Alexander, busy with the administration of the empire, arrived at his bedside only moments after he died. The king's grief was not human. It was cataclysmic. He lay on the body for a day and a night, tame, refusing to move. He ordered the doctor who failed to save him crucified. He shaved his head and ordered the manes of all the horses in the army sheared, so that even the beasts would mourn. He banned music across the empire. He sent envoys to the oracle of Siwa to ask if Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. Alexander emerged from his tent changed. The fire that had driven him across the world had turned cold and nihilistic. He was 32 years old, the master of the earth, and he was entirely alone. He launched a brutal campaign against the Caucaeans in the Zagros Mountains, slaughtering them in a sacrifice to the ghost of Hephaestion. He was killing simply to feel something. He returned to Babylon in 323 BC, a ghost haunting his own palace. He began planning a massive invasion of Arabia, and perhaps even Rome and Carthage to the west. But his body, weakened by malaria, alcohol, and a decade of war, was finally failing. The son of Zeus was proving to be mortal after all. Conclusion. In June of 323 BC, the heat in Babylon was suffocating. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander lay dying. The fever had seized him after a night of heavy drinking, stripping away his strength hour by hour. The most feared army in the world gathered outside the palace walls, their shields lowered, weeping in silence. The soldiers demanded to see him one last time. In a scene of tragic pathos, the veterans filed past his bed. Alexander, unable to speak, could only struggle to raise his hand and move his eyes to acknowledge the men who had followed him to the edge of the world. When his generals, the successors, leaned in close to ask the question that would doom the empire, "To whom do you leave the kingdom?" Alexander whispered his final, ambiguous curse, "To the strongest, Kratistos." He died on June 11th, shortly before his 33rd birthday. The chaos that followed was immediate. The empire he had stitched together with spear and will tore itself apart. His mother, Olympias, his wife, Roxana, and his young son were all murdered in the scramble for power. The generals carved up the map, turning the unified world into a patchwork of warring kingdoms. In a political sense, Alexander failed. He built a structure that could not stand without him. Yet in the grand arc of history, his legacy is inescapable. He did not just conquer territory, he accelerated time. By forcing the collision of Greece and Persia, he birthed the Hellenistic Age, a vibrant era of cultural synthesis that allowed Greek art, philosophy, and language to flood the East, while Eastern science and religion flowed west. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual lighthouse of humanity, preserving the knowledge that would eventually fuel the Renaissance. Christianity itself would later spread across the roads Alexander opened, written in the Greek language he planted. He remains the ultimate Rorschach test of history. To the Romans, he was the supreme general, the standard against which Caesar and Pompey measured themselves. To the Persians, he was Alexander the Accursed, the destroyer of temples. To the modern mind, he is a terrifying example of what happens when human capability is unshackled from human morality. Alexander taught the world two powerful, contradictory lessons. First, that the unreasonable man changes the world. He proved that geography, numbers, and logic are no match for sheer, unyielding willpower. He showed us that the impossible is often just a boundary waiting for someone brave enough to cross it. But he also taught us the cost of such glory. He burned so brightly that he consumed everything around him: his friends, his family, his army, and finally, himself. He died young, surrounded by vultures, proving that while you can conquer the world, you cannot conquer your own mortality. He lies somewhere in the dust of history, his tomb lost to time, but his shadow still stretches across the world. He was the comet that set the sky on fire, and we are still living in the light and the ruin that he left behind.